I'm Helen Markham, 68 years old, and this Mother's Day, I found myself wearing the forest green cardigan my son gave me when he was 17. I'd kept it folded away for years, the cuffs worn soft, the color still deep as pine needles in shade. Outside, the morning was unusually still. No barking from next door, no trash truck, just the steady hum of my refrigerator and the kitchen clock marking time. I told myself today might be different, that Michael might remember who I used to be to him. I didn't know that by sundown, the space between us would feel wider than it ever had before. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever held on to a small hope that someone you love would see you again. I grew up in a small Illinois town where people waved to each other from porches, and a promise meant as much as a signature. My parents weren't wealthy, but they taught me to value work kindness and keeping your word. I carried those lessons into my nursing career, working nights and doubles to keep our home running when Daniel's teaching job couldn't stretch far enough. When Michael came along, I poured myself into raising him, packing lunches before dawn, sewing patches onto jeans after dark, making sure he knew he was loved in every way I could show it. We didn't have much money, but we had warmth, and in those years, I thought that would always be enough. Life felt steady until Daniel passed away. That was when the silences between visits with Michael began to stretch, and his calls grew shorter. He married Vanessa a few years later, and their world seemed brighter, faster, more polished than mine. Their townhouse had the kind of sleek counters and glass doors you see in magazines, not the scuffed wood and mismatched mugs I'd grown comfortable with. I told myself it was natural children build lives that looked different from their parents. But part of me noticed how seldom those lives left room for me. That morning, my phone buzzed with a short text from Michael Carr will pick you. No greeting, no punctuation, no happy Mother's Day. Still, I smoothed the sleeves of my cardigan, added a touch of lipstick, and stepped into the rideshare that arrived a few minutes early. The closer we got to their street, the more I noticed the bright balloons on their porch, the fresh flowers along the walk. The door was already ajar when I knocked, and inside, voices and laughter spilled from the kitchen. Vanessa appeared in a deep red dress, smiling politely, and told me her mother was in the living room. I stepped toward the noise, scanning for Michael. He was near the fireplace, laughing with Vanessa's brother, his shoulders loose, his smile easy. I stood for a moment before someone pointed me to the kitchen island, where a place card with my name sat beside a plastic cup and napkin. From that seat, I could see the row of gifts stacked neatly on the counter. I didn't know it yet, but the way those packages would be opened and what was inside would draw a quiet line I couldn't uncross. From my seat at the kitchen island, I could see everything without really being part of it. The music was low, the air carrying the smell of roasted chicken and something sweet baking in the oven. Conversations overlapped, voices rising and falling, the laughter from the living room spilling into the kitchen in bursts. Vanessa's mother stood near the counter, her manicured hands resting lightly on the edge as she chatted with two of her friends. Michael stepped into the center of the room, carrying a white velvet box. He handed it to his mother-in-law, and her face lit up the moment she opened it. A platinum necklace caught the light in a way that made the whole room pause. People clapped, a few whistled, and she reached up to fasten it around her neck while Michael smiled beside her. Then he passed her an envelope, which she opened slowly. Her voice carried across the kitchen as she read the words aloud, a 2-week trip to Italy. The cheers were louder this time, glasses lifted in toasts, and someone called out a joke about packing early. I glanced down at the folded napkin in my lap, my fingers smoothing it without thinking. When Michael finally turned toward me, his steps seemed shorter, his smile less practiced. He held out a small paper bag. Inside was a $20 gift card to a coffee shop a few blocks from my apartment, and a pink plastic keychain in the shape of a heart. The words, "Best Grandma," were stamped across it in gold letters. I managed a smile and a thank you, my voice even before he turned back toward Vanessa and the others. A few people began gathering near the sliding glass doors for photos. Michael's arm went around his mother-in-law's shoulders in one shot, then around Vanessa's in the next. Her family clustered together in different combinations. Each one met with another burst from the camera. I stayed seated, my place card still in front of me, the gift bag tucked beside it. No one asked me to join. The hum of the dishwasher started behind me, its steady rhythm filling the quiet in my corner. My lemonade had gone warm in the plastic cup. After a while, I slipped down from the high stool, placing the napkin neatly on the counter. The front door was only a few steps away, but I paused before reaching for it. Michael appeared then, walking me out with a polite nod, saying they had friends coming by soon and needed the space. Vanessa had already gone upstairs. Outside, the air had cooled. The sun was low, painting the driveway in shades of orange and gold. I waited on the curb for the car Michael hadn't offered to call. When it arrived, I climbed in, fastening my seatbelt while the driver adjusted the radio. The ride was quiet, the passing houses blurring into one another. In the reflection of the window, my face seemed softer, the lines at the corners of my eyes more pronounced under the streetlights. At home, I set the small bag on the counter without opening it again. I didn't turn on the lights, moving through the rooms by the faint glow from the street outside. In the kitchen, I reached into the refrigerator for the 2 boiled eggs I'd made the night before and placed them in a bowl. I sat at the table, the fork untouched beside me, and let my eyes rest on the empty chair across from mine. Later that week, I walked to the pharmacy for a refill on my blood pressure prescription. The sun was bright enough to make me squint, the air warm on my shoulders. I thought about taking the long way back, maybe circling around the lake, but habit carried me toward the familiar sidewalk. Passing near Michael's building, I remembered leaving my scarf in his guest bathroom the day of the gathering. It wasn't valuable, just soft and warm, something I'd had for years. The front door to the building opened easily when another resident left. I moved quietly through the hallway, the carpet muffling my steps. Near the kitchen window of Michael's unit, I heard voices low, steady. Vanessa's tone was measured, but the words were sharp. She said Michael needed to sign certain papers right away, that delays could cause problems, especially with her still in the picture. There was a pause before she spoke again, and this time the words cut through the afternoon stillness. She said I wouldn't be around much longer, that Michael kept mentioning how frail I seemed, and that things would work themselves out before summer. I stayed still, my hand tightening around the strap of my purse. Backing away from the window, I turned the corner toward the stairwell. My steps felt slower, heavier. Outside, I found the nearest bus stop and sat down. My gaze fixed on the empty stretch of road ahead. The voices still echoed each word, deliberate, without hesitation. This wasn't a moment of frustration or carelessness. It sounded like planning. When I reached home, I walked straight to the bedroom and pulled open the nightstand drawer. Inside was a small tin I hadn't touched in years. It held old keys, copies of important documents, and notes Daniel had written in his careful script. My hands hovered over it for a moment before I closed the drawer again. Not tonight, but soon. That night, I lay in bed, the window open just enough to let in the cool air. I could still hear her voice in my mind, calm and certain, talking about a future without me in it. The ceiling above me stayed dark, the minutes stretching into hours. Before the sun rose, I was in the hallway closet, pushing aside a heavy winter coat and a stack of old tax folders. My hand found the metal box Daniel and I had agreed to keep locked just in case. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down, my fingers tracing the cool surface before I opened it. Inside were the documents we had stored years ago, our marriage license, the deed to the condo insurance papers, and the will we had drafted when Michael was still in school. Near the bottom was a document I didn't recognize. It was a power of attorney giving Michael full control over my financial decisions and property. The signature was mine in appearance, but the curve of the letters felt wrong, like it had been practiced. There was no notary seal. The date was only 6 months ago. Another paper listed Michael as the sole controller of a trust account tied to the condo one that had always been in both Daniel's and my names. I placed the documents side by side, the morning light moving slowly across them. This was not a mistake. It was deliberate, careful. At the very bottom of the box, under a folded sheet of tissue, was a letter from Daniel. His handwriting was the same as always, steady and clear. He reminded me to protect what we had built, but never at the cost of my own dignity. I placed the letter to the side and reached for a notepad from the drawer. I began writing names, dates, every detail that felt wrong. My pen didn't stop until the page was filled, then another, then another. I stayed at the table for hours that morning, pages of my notepad spread beside the open metal box. The kitchen light shifted from pale yellow to the brighter white of midday, but I barely moved. The documents lay in neat piles, the power of attorney, on top the altered trust account statement underneath. I went through each page twice, then 3 times, making sure I understood what was missing and what had been changed. By early afternoon, I reached for the phone and called Judy, an old colleague from the hospital. Her voice was as steady as I remembered, quick to listen without interrupting. I told her about the papers I had found, the missing notary seal, the signature that didn't match my hand, the dates that didn't line up. I described the trust account being moved under Michael's name alone. When I paused, she asked a few short questions, her tone careful. Then she gave me the name of an attorney she trusted, a woman named Sheila Grant, who specialized in estate fraud and elder protection. After we hung up, I gathered the documents into a large manila envelope and placed it inside my purse. I sat for a while looking around my apartment, the framed photo of Daniel on the mantel, the ceramic vase we bought at a church fundraiser years ago, the bookshelf where Michael's high school trophies still sat in a neat row. Everything looked the same, but the air in the room felt different, as if I'd stepped into a space that belonged to someone else. The next morning, I drove across town to Sheila's office. The building was small, tucked behind a row of older storefronts with a mailbox covered in ivy. Inside, the waiting area was quiet, the scent of coffee lingering in the air. Sheila's assistant greeted me with a warm smile, offering a clipboard with a short form. I wrote only what was needed: retired nurse, suspicious financial documents, potential fraud. When Sheila called me into her office, she listened closely, her hands resting on a yellow legal pad. I slid the envelope across the desk. She opened it, laying each page in a careful line, scanning the text and markings. Her brow tightened slightly when she reached the power of attorney, then again at the trust account statement. She asked if I had any other related paperwork. I told her this was all I had for now. She explained the steps we could take, verifying each signature, checking state records for the notary, tracing property transfers. She said it might take time, but she had seen cases like this reversed before. When I left her office, the envelope was lighter, the weight now in the hands of someone who knew what to do. Driving home, I thought of the words I had overheard outside Michael's kitchen window, and how easily they might have stayed just words if I hadn't looked in that box. 2 days later, I was locking my apartment door when the door across the hall opened. Mrs. Thompson stepped out in her housecoat and slippers, a mug in her hand. We'd shared polite greetings over the years, but never more than that. She asked if I had a moment, her voice low. She said she had seen Michael in the hallway about 3 weeks ago carrying a stack of papers. He stopped near the copy room at the end of the corridor, flipping through them while talking on his phone. She went on to say that Vanessa had been by twice in the past month, each time with a folder and a large zip drive. Then she looked at me directly and said she'd overheard Michael telling Vanessa that once I signed the last piece of paper, everything else would fall into place. That had been right before Mother's Day. She said she'd kept quiet because it wasn't her business, but after noticing how tired I looked lately, she thought I should know. I invited her in, and we sat at my kitchen table. I brought out the copies of the documents and showed her the forged power of attorney and the altered trust account. She studied them carefully, her hands steady. Then she told me something else. One afternoon, she'd heard Vanessa talking to a man named Dennis on speakerphone in the hallway. Vanessa had said she would deliver the revised copy and make sure the old woman didn't realize what she was signing. Mrs. Thompson agreed to write down everything she remembered, including dates and approximate times. We both signed and dated the page, her neat handwriting filling the lines. She said she'd be willing to tell my lawyer if it came to that. I thanked her, feeling for the first time in days that I wasn't entirely alone in this. That evening, I lit a single candle on the counter and sat at the table with my notes, the signed statement from Mrs. Thompson, and the memories of every interaction with Michael and Vanessa over the past 6 months. I began building a timeline: dinners, calls, changes in my mail, unexplained gaps in bills. Page by page, the pattern became clearer. 2 mornings later, I was back in Sheila's office. The documents from Mrs. Thompson were added to the growing file. Sheila had already been working on her own review, and she said some of the signatures on the power of attorney appeared to be scanned from an older file. The notary listed wasn't registered in the state system. She also found that my condo had been tied to a new business loan with Michael listed as managing executive. Vanessa's maiden name appeared on one of the background documents as a silent partner. Sheila explained that they were opening a real estate firm and that my assets had been used as collateral without my knowledge. Offices had already been leased, branding approved, and a website in progress. She spread the papers across her desk, handing me a highlighter so we could mark each questionable transfer, each missing approval. My hands were steady as I went through the pages, marking them one by one. When I left that day, I carried a folder filled with copies and notes. The sky was clear, and as I passed the courthouse, I saw a boy in the park, flying a red kite, his mother clapping nearby. For a moment, I thought of Michael at that age, his small hands gripping the string, his face turned toward the wind. The image stayed with me all the way home. That night, I placed the folder in my old hope chest beside Michael's baby book. I closed the lid, sat for a while in the quiet, and began planning my next step. The morning after my meeting with Sheila, I woke before sunrise. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I made a cup of coffee, but by the time I sat down at the table, it had already cooled. The folder from Sheila lay in front of me, a thick stack of paper that seemed heavier than it should be. I opened it again, reading each note she'd made in the margins. I'd spent my entire career noticing details. Other people missed a patient's uneven breathing, a subtle change in skin color, the way someone's hands trembled when they said they weren't in pain. That instinct was pulling at me now. The signatures, the missing witness lines, the altered account numbers, they formed a picture I couldn't ignore. I started making a second list, not of documents this time, but of moments. The day my gas bill stopped arriving. The month the property tax statement came addressed to Michael. The phone call when Vanessa offered to help me update my healthcare directive, even though nothing had changed. Small things, each one, but together they pointed in the same direction. By mid-morning, I decided I needed more than paper proof. I pulled my coat from the closet and walked to the print shop 3 blocks away. Inside, the warm air smelled faintly of toner and cardboard. I handed the manila envelope to the clerk and asked for 5 complete sets of copies. While the machine hummed, I stood to the side watching each page slide into the output tray. When they were ready, I tucked them into separate envelopes and labeled each one with a number. Back at home, I placed 1 copy in my hope chest, another in the drawer under my phone, and a third in the kitchen cabinet behind a stack of old cookbooks. The 4th I planned to give to Judy, and the last would go to Sheila's office. That afternoon, I called Judy again. She agreed to meet for coffee at a small diner near the bus station. When I slid into the booth, she was already there, a notebook open in front of her. I gave her the envelope and explained where the other copies were. She didn't ask many questions, just wrote down each location and nodded. Before we left, she told me she'd keep the envelope in her safe deposit box. Over the next 2 days, I kept my movements quiet. I went to the grocery store, picked up my prescription, and returned home without lingering anywhere. Each time I passed the kitchen counter, the sight of that folder reminded me of how much I still didn't know. I began checking my mail daily, not just for bills, but for anything that looked out-of-place envelopes with unfamiliar return addresses, statements I hadn't requested, or missing notices I should have received. Late Thursday morning, Sheila called. She asked if I could come in the next day. She'd found something important. Her voice was calm, but the pause before she spoke told me enough. I agreed to be there first thing. Friday was overcast, the kind of day where the sky stays the same dull gray from morning to night. Sheila greeted me in her office with a small stack of new documents. She explained that her search had turned up business filings for a newly registered real estate company. Michael was listed as managing executive, and Vanessa's maiden name appeared in the paperwork as a silent partner. The part that caught my attention most was the collateral listed for the business loan my condo tied directly to the trust account. The loan had been approved just 3 months earlier. Offices were already leased, and the branding work had begun. Sheila showed me printouts of bank statements with transfers from accounts in my name to ones tied to the business. She handed me a highlighter, and together we went page by page, marking each questionable item. Some were small withdrawals, others were large transfers, but every one had been made without my consent. By the end, the pages were covered in bright lines. When I left her office that afternoon, I took the long way home. I passed the park near the courthouse where a group of children were flying kites. Their laughter carried on the wind, and for a moment I remembered Michael at that age running across the grass with his own kite, the tail streaming behind him. The memory stayed with me as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. That evening, I sat in my living room with the folder open on my lap. The quiet felt different now, not the stillness of being alone, but the kind that comes when you're gathering yourself for what's next. I knew I couldn't avoid facing Michael much longer. If I wanted the truth, I would have to look him in the eye and hear what he said. I closed the folder and set it on the coffee table. Tomorrow, I would call him. The next morning, I called Michael. My voice stayed even though my hand tightened around the phone. I suggested we meet somewhere quiet, away from his house and my apartment. He agreed, his tone neutral, and we settled on the cafe across from the park, the same place I used to take him for hot chocolate when he was a boy. I arrived early, choosing a booth by the window where I could see the park entrance. 2 folders sat on the table in front of me, one navy blue and one manila. Inside, one was the original valid power of attorney signed years ago under the proper witness. Inside the other was the forged document Sheila had confirmed was fraudulent. I kept my hands folded in my lap, watching the street outside as the minutes passed. Michael came in 5 minutes late, still looking down at his phone as he slid into the seat across from me. He glanced at the folders but didn't ask. Instead, he commented on how well I looked. His smile practiced the kind meant to smooth over any tension. I let the quiet stretch between us before I told him I had spoken with someone from the trust and estate office. His eyes flicked toward the folders, then back to me. I explained that the review had uncovered documents I had never signed, changes to accounts I had never approved, and the use of my property as collateral for a business I had no part in. I told him the power of attorney he had used was invalid, and that the assets he had moved were still legally mine. He leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table. He said Vanessa had been eager, that they'd been talking about future plans, nothing final. Nothing that had actually taken anything from me. I reached for the navy folder, sliding it toward him. The proper document with its clear witness signatures lay inside. Then I opened the manila folder, showing him the forgery, the scanned signature, the missing notary seal, the mismatched dates. For a moment, he stared at the papers without speaking. Then he said, "It must have been Vanessa's handwriting, not his." I didn't respond. I let the weight of the silence do the rest. Finally, I told him the trust lawyer would be restoring ownership immediately, that the firm's filings were already under review, and that I was not filing criminal charges yet. His expression shifted, the ease gone from his face. He asked if we could talk again soon, but I only said, "Maybe not here, not like this." I closed the folders, placed them back into my bag, and stood. We left the cafe separately. The following afternoon, I was sitting in my living room when my front door opened without a knock. Vanessa stepped inside, holding her phone in one hand, a folder in the other. She still had the spare key from years ago when I'd needed help after hip surgery. I hadn't thought to change the lock. That would change before nightfall. She stopped when she saw the folders on the table. Her eyes flickered, but her voice stayed calm. She said everything could have been resolved if I had come to them first. I told her my name had been illegally removed from property and financial documents, and my lawyer had already taken action to reverse it. She started explaining that Michael was worried about me living alone, that they'd been trying to simplify things. I walked to the cabinet by the window, opened the drawer, and took out the original deed to my condo. The paper was worn at the edges, the ink slightly faded, but my signature was clear. I set it on the table next to the trust papers. I told her I had worked double shifts for nearly 2 decades, that Daniel and I had built this home without help from anyone else. I reminded her of the times I'd been there for her, sewing her wedding veil, driving her mother to every appointment during chemo. My voice stayed steady as I said I knew exactly what they had done and that there was no way back from it. Her calm slipped for a moment. She said they had invested too much in the business to stop now. She called it a misunderstanding, then a miscommunication, then an overstep. I didn't move from my chair. I told her the trust had been restructured, the transfers reversed, and the copies secured. This would not be undone quietly. Her last words before leaving were that I was ruining Michael's life. I told her he had done that himself the moment he decided my worth could be signed away. She turned sharply, her heels striking the floor, and the door closed behind her. I took the spare key from the dish on the counter and snapped it in two before dropping it in the trash. That evening, I called Sheila and told her to move forward with every step we'd discussed. It was no longer about waiting for an explanation. It was about making sure this couldn't happen again. By Monday morning, Sheila's team had completed their review. She called me in early, and when I arrived, the file on her desk was twice as thick as before. She motioned for me to sit, then began going through the results one page at a time. Every document Michael and Vanessa had submitted carried inconsistencies, mismatched dates, missing witness signatures, unregistered notary stamps. The fraudulent power of attorney was formally revoked, effective immediately. My name was restored to every title deed and account it had been removed from. Sheila explained that each unauthorized transfer had been reversed and the assets placed back under my control. The business they had launched collapsed almost overnight. The LLC had been built entirely on collateral taken from my property and accounts. With the trust assets frozen and my ownership reinstated, their financing was gone before the first client could sign a contract. Sheila spoke plainly without embellishment, laying out the facts so there would be no misunderstanding. I signed the last of the paperwork with a steady hand. When it was done, I closed the folder and slid it back across the desk to her. She told me she'd keep monitoring the situation until every loose end was tied off. I thanked her, then walked out into the cool air, feeling the wind against my face, as if I'd been holding my breath for weeks. The next day, I made an appointment with my financial advisor. We met in his office, the one with tall windows that overlooked the courthouse lawn. I told him I wanted to establish a legacy fund for retired nurses over 70, especially those living alone without family to advocate for them. We went over the details, the percentage of my assets to move the process for appointing a board, the paperwork that would be needed. By Friday afternoon, 60% of what I owned had been transferred into the fund. The remainder I kept for myself, enough to live simply and securely. My advisor shook my hand before I left, his expression warm but professional, and told me it was a good choice. I didn't disagree. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table sorting through the last of my old notebooks. Some still held shift schedules from my years at the hospital, others lists of supplies or patient notes. In the margin of one, written during a long winter night 10 years ago, I'd copied a line I'd overheard from the hospital chaplain. The opposite of abandonment is not attachment. It is integrity. I closed the book and placed it in the donation box by the door. Michael called once over the weekend. I let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. I didn't block the number. I simply chose not to answer. Vanessa didn't reach out at all. I imagined they were both occupied trying to dismantle what remained of a plan that had unraveled faster than they expected. The following Monday, I cleared a space on the counter and placed the spare keys Michael had left years ago into a small padded envelope. Alongside them, I added the beaded bracelet he'd made in Sunday school when he was 8 blue plastic beads that spelled Mom. For a long time, I'd thought I might be buried with it. That morning, it felt right to send it back. I sealed the envelope and walked it down to the mailbox. The metal was cool under my fingertips as I dropped it in. Outside, the air was calm, the street quiet, except for the sound of leaves moving in a light breeze. I stood there a moment before heading back upstairs. Inside, I turned to the back of my dresser and pulled out a framed photo I hadn't looked at in months. Michael was about 6 in it, standing beside me at a fall fair, his arm wrapped around my neck, his front tooth missing. I sat with it in my lap for a while, then opened the back of the frame and slid the photo out. I didn't tear it or throw it away. I simply trimmed it, removing my own image from the picture. The cut edges were clean, leaving only the boy with outstretched arms, his face turned toward the camera. I placed the altered photo back in the frame and hung it near the bookshelf. There was a gap beside him now, just empty space where something had once been. I stepped back and looked at it, the quiet of the room settling around me. It wasn't an emptiness that needed to be filled. It was a space I had reclaimed. 2 weeks after the fund was established, I received confirmation from Sheila that every piece of the case was closed. The fraudulent power of attorney was permanently voided, the property liens removed, and the accounts fully restored. She sent me copies of the court filings neatly bound and labeled. I placed them in the top drawer of my desk, knowing I might never need them again, but wanting them close just the same. Word of the investigation must have reached Michael and Vanessa quickly. A few days later, an envelope arrived with Michael's handwriting on the front. Inside was a brief letter, no more than 4 sentences, saying he wished things could have gone differently and asking if we could talk. I read it once, then folded it back into the envelope and placed it on the hall table. I didn't call. Vanessa never contacted me directly, but I heard from Judy that the business had already given up its office lease. The website they'd launched was gone, the phone line disconnected. Whatever plans they had built were gone, not with a fight, but in silence. One afternoon, I stopped by the bank to finalize the last of the account protections Sheila had recommended. The branch manager, Mr. Carter, greeted me at his office door and shook my hand warmly. We went over each safeguard dual authorization for transfers, physical statements mailed only to my home, and a separate account for the fund that couldn't be accessed without board approval. When we finished, he slid the signed forms into a folder and said, "You're all set now." Leaving the bank, I walked past the florist's shop on the corner. In the window, a row of potted orchids sat in the sunlight. Daniel had once given me one just like them for our anniversary, saying it was the kind of plant that lasted if you cared for it properly. I paused for a moment before heading home. The days that followed were steady, each one a little lighter than the one before. I cleaned out the last of the files in my hope chest, keeping only the documents that mattered: the deed, the will, and Daniel's letter. The rest went into the shredder, the sound of the blades steady and final. On a Saturday morning, Mrs. Thompson knocked on my door. She handed me a small tin of cookies she'd baked, saying she'd been thinking about me. We sat at the table for a while, talking about ordinary things: the weather, her daughter's upcoming visit, the repairs they were doing in the lobby. Before she left, she touched my hand and said she was glad I'd taken care of it all. That night, I pulled out the altered photograph from the bookshelf. Michael's small figure stood in the frame, arms reaching upward into empty space. I studied it for a long time, tracing the edge of the cut with my thumb. Then I hung it back on the wall, exactly where it had been. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee. The apartment was quiet, but it didn't feel hollow. I opened the curtains to let in the light, the sun spilling across the room in soft gold. There was no letter to answer, no call to make, and no papers waiting to be signed. Only the day ahead, mine to keep. Still, I knew there was one more step to take before I could close this chapter entirely. I knew the last step wasn't paperwork or another phone call. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a short letter to Michael. I kept it simple. I loved him. I was safe, and I would not allow anyone to manage my life again. I sealed it, walked it to the mailbox, and let the envelope go. The next morning, a locksmith changed the deadbolt while I made coffee. The old lock came off with a clean clink. The new one slid into place without ceremony. When he left, I turned the knob twice, listening to the soft click that said, "This home," answered only to me. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, and asked if she had a minute. She came by with that careful smile of hers, the one that says she understands more than she shows. I thanked her for speaking up when it mattered, and handed her a small plant for her window. We stood by the door a while, talking about the elevator repairs and the weather, ordinary topics that felt steady again. Later that week, I met with the foundation staff to sign the first round of documents for the fund. We went over the small grants process and the way applications would be reviewed. There was nothing dramatic about the meeting, just clear steps and firm signatures. When I left, I knew exactly where a portion of my savings would go and who it would help. I drove to the cemetery after that and parked under the old oak. Daniel's marker sat where it always had, square and unassuming. I told him I had set things right, that our home was safe, and our names were where they belonged. The wind moved through the branches above me, and I stayed until the shadows started to grow. At home, I opened the hope chest and lifted out the last stack of papers. I kept the deed, the will, and Daniel's letter. Everything else went through the shredder. The sound was steady and final, like a zipper closing on a suitcase I no longer needed to carry. Michael wrote once more, a short message asking if we could meet. I answered with the same brief honesty I'd used in my letter. I wished him well and told him my door would stay closed until we could talk without threats, plans, or excuses. I did not send the message to hurt him. I sent it to hold the ground I had finally reclaimed. That evening, I walked the length of my apartment and paused at the framed photo by the bookshelf. The boy in the picture still reached toward empty space, and for the first time, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like room, the kind a person needs to stand up straight. What I learned is simple. Love is not a blank check, and protection is not the same as control. When you choose dignity, you choose a steady kind of peace, the kind that lets you sleep and wake without rehearsing your defense. I used the law to protect my name, and I used my voice to protect my life. Both mattered. If any part of this reminded you to keep your own footing, I'm glad we spent this time together. Tell me what stayed with you, or share your story if you're ready. And if you'd like to hear more quiet victories like this, stay close.